Hello everyone. Tonight, our story begins with a descent into one of history's most profound and unsettling questions. Imagine, if you will, a city known as the Gateway to the East, a metropolis of 500,000 souls, a place of stunning colonnaded streets, theaters that seated thousands, and public fountains so ornate they were considered works of art. A city where philosophers from Athens debated with merchants from Persia, and where the wealth of an empire flowed through its grand public squares. Now try to envision that same city a few centuries later, reduced to a small walled town of barely 20,000 people, its magnificent avenues buried under feet of silt, its once proud temples used as pens for goats, and its sophisticated water systems a forgotten memory. This is not fantasy. This is the story of Antioch. And Antioch was not an isolated case. From the sands of North Africa to the forests of Britain, the intricate urban network that formed the backbone of an entire civilization simply withered away. Tonight, we ask how and why the most advanced urban society the world had ever known simply ceased to exist. But before we venture into these historical enigmas together, it would mean the world to me if you would support the channel by hitting that subscribe button and liking this video, especially if you're one of the amazing people who feels a thrill when exploring the great puzzles of the past. If the story resonates with you, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a deep historical mystery, that person in your life who is fascinated by lost civilizations. And I am genuinely curious to know where this story is finding you tonight. Are you watching from a cafe in London, a university library in Sydney? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone and love connecting with this global community of history enthusiasts. Now find a comfortable spot and let's begin our journey back in time. There is a unique sense of awe in standing where the pulse of an ancient metropolis once beat. If you visit the ruins of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, you can walk down the Arcadian Way, a spectacular marble-paved street that once led from the harbor to the Grand Theater, but try to peel back the layers of time and see it as historians like Dr. Sarah Cormack of Washington and Lee University describe it in the year 200 AD. This wasn't a silent ruin. It was the commercial and social heart of a city of over 250,000 people. Imagine towering apartment blocks known as insulae rising on either side, their ground floors filled with shops selling fine glassware, intricate jewelry, and colorful textiles. The air would be thick with the sounds of a dozen languages: Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Lycian, as sailors from Egypt and traders from Gaul haggled over prices. You'd hear the rumble of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on stone, and the constant murmur from the Library of Celsus, which held over 12,000 scrolls and served as one of the ancient world's great centers of learning. But what is truly staggering about Roman-era cities is that they possessed public services that much of Europe would not see again until the Victorian era. We are talking about complex sewer systems that kept streets sanitary, heated public bathhouses that were social and business hubs, and even public latrines with flushing water. According to research by Professor Andrew Wilson at the University of Oxford, the city of Leptis Magna in modern-day Libya had a massive bathing complex, the Hadrianic Baths, that covered several acres and was supplied with fresh water by a dedicated aqueduct, and this sophistication was everywhere. Let's journey to Roman Carthage on the coast of modern Tunisia. In 300 AD, it was a thriving metropolis of over 300,000 people. Its harbor teemed with ships exporting North African grain and olive oil to the rest of the empire, It boasted a 400-mile-long aqueduct, a massive circus for chariot racing that could hold over 60,000 spectators, and vibrant schools of philosophy and rhetoric that rivaled those in Athens and Alexandria. Or consider Carnuntum on the Danube River in modern-day Austria. What began as a military fortress became a bustling city of 50,000, complete with a massive amphitheater, a school for gladiators, and a forum where one could purchase amber from the Baltic and wine from Italy. Now this is where the narrative becomes both brilliant and deeply tragic. These cities were not accidental sprawls. Based on the work of scholars like Professor J.B. Ward Perkins, we know that Roman cities were master-planned communities. Each was laid out on a grid system with two main intersecting streets, the Cardo and Decumanus. They had a designated public square for business and government, strategically placed temples and theaters, and sophisticated zoning that separated an industrial areas from residential ones. Yet the true marvel of these cities was their shared culture. Imagine you are a potter from La Grafesanca in southern Gaul, arriving in the city of Gade, modern Cadiz in Spain. Though you are 1,000 miles from home, the layout of the city would be instantly familiar. You would find the same style of public baths to relax in, the same legal framework governing your business dealings, and the same currency in your purse. It was the first time in history that one could feel truly at home across an entire continent. The economic system that fueled this urban world was astonishingly complex. Archaeological discoveries such as the wreck of the Madrague de Gines off the coast of France, documented by maritime archaeologist Patrice Pomy, reveal merchant ships capable of carrying over 10,000 amphorae of wine in a single voyage. This was not small-scale trade, this was industrial-level logistics. We know that North African red slipware pottery was mass-produced and exported to every corner of the empire, from Britain to the Black Sea. Spanish olive oil fed the city of Rome, while Egyptian grain supplied the legions on the German frontier. But more than anything, these cities embodied a revolutionary concept that life was better, safer, and more prosperous in a diverse, interconnected urban community. They faced immense challenges: disease, inequality, crime. But the sheer ambition of creating such complex and livable cities on such a scale was a feat unparalleled in the ancient world. So what went so terribly wrong? How does a civilization so advanced, so wealthy, and so organized simply let its greatest achievements crumble into dust? The explanation is not a simple one, and it certainly isn't the story most of us were taught in school. This is not a straightforward tale of barbarian conquest, though that is part of the narrative, nor is it purely a story of imperial decline, though the empire certainly fell. This is a story about the fragility of complex systems, about how the very things that make a civilization strong can also become its greatest weaknesses. And as we delve into this mystery, you may find that the forces that brought down the Roman urban world feel disturbingly relevant to our own. But first, we must grasp the sheer brilliance of these Roman cities to understand why their disappearance constitutes one of history's greatest losses. Don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this investigation. In our next section, we will walk the streets of a Roman city at its zenith to experience the urban miracle firsthand. So let us journey back to the year 180 AD to the city of Lugdunum, the capital of Roman Gaul, located in what is now Lyon, France, a city that was, in its day, a true marvel of the Roman world. Imagine you are a wine merchant from Hispania arriving at the gates of Lugdunum on a bright spring day. The first thing to strike you would be its commanding position, built at the confluence of two major rivers, the Rhone and the Saône. The city's walls enclose a vibrant metropolis of over 50,000 people, but it's when you pass through the main gate that the city truly overwhelms the senses. The air is filled with the clatter of craftsmen's hammers, the calls of boatmen on the rivers below, and the murmur of Latin spoken with a distinct Gallic accent. You can smell baking bread from the city's many pistrina bakeries, the scent of cedarwood from workshops making fine furniture, and the rich aroma of Italian olive oil and Spanish garum, fish sauce, being sold in the central market. Let me astound you with some figures that archaeologists have painstakingly assembled. At its height, Lugdunum was the administrative and economic hub of the three Gallic provinces. It was home to the imperial mint for all of Gaul, producing millions of coins that circulated from Britain to Germany. Its urban plan was a masterpiece. The main road, the Via Agrippa, was a marvel of engineering that connected the city to the Atlantic coast. Along this and other avenues were multi-story apartment buildings with shops and taverns on the ground floor. Their walls were often adorned with vibrant frescoes, advertising everything from political candidates to upcoming gladiatorial games. But here is where Roman urbanism becomes truly awe-inspiring. Every major public building in Lugdunum was a testament to the power and wealth of the empire. The city had not one but two major theaters. The Grand Theater, built into the side of the Fourviere Hill, could seat 10,000 spectators for plays. Right next to it was the Odeon, a smaller, more intimate venue for musical performances that could seat 3,000. And what about infrastructure? Lugdunum was supplied with fresh water by 4 separate aqueducts, totaling over 40 miles in length. This water fed the city's fountains, its public baths, and the homes of its wealthiest citizens. The main sewer, the Cloaca Maxima of Lugdunum, was an underground marvel that ran for nearly a mile, channeling waste and rainwater safely into the river. Now, let's talk about something that showcases the heart of Roman civic life, the amphitheater of the Three Gauls. This arena could hold 20,000 people, drawing spectators from all over the province, but its engineering was what made it special. Archaeologists have discovered that its foundations were designed to be exceptionally stable, allowing it to be built on relatively soft ground near the river. It had a complex system of underground tunnels known as carceres, where gladiators and wild animals were kept before being lifted onto the arena floor by mechanical elevators. But what truly defined a city like Lugdunum was its diversity. Inscriptions found in the city commemorate merchants from Syria, soldiers from the Danube frontier, and craftsmen from Greece, all living and working side by side. In the city's market, you could find fine red gloss pottery made locally in Gallic workshops, sitting right next to glassware from Alexandria and amber jewelry from the Baltic Sea. The city's residential districts tell a similar story of sophistication. The elite lived in luxurious domus with beautiful mosaic floors depicting mythological scenes, private gardens with ornate fountains, and underfloor heating systems. Yet even common citizens lived with comforts that would be unimaginable in most of medieval Europe. The insula, or apartment blocks, often had shared latrines connected to the sewer system, access to public fountains for fresh water, and ground floor bakeries and cook shops that served as the ancient equivalent of fast food restaurants. What is always astonishing is the sheer cosmopolitan nature of these cities. A tombstone might belong to a Greek doctor living next to a family of retired Gallic soldiers whose son has just married the daughter of an Italian wine importer. This degree of cultural fusion would not be seen again in most of Europe for more than 1,000 years, and the technology, it would have seemed like magic. Lugdunum had a public fire brigade, the Vigil, who were trained to fight the frequent fires in the crowded city. It had public scribes who could write letters for the illiterate, and lawyers who could navigate the empire's complex legal system. It even had a sophisticated river port with massive stone quays and warehouses where goods could be transferred from large river barges to smaller boats or onto wagons for land transport. But perhaps most impressive was the sheer confidence of it all. As Professor Ward Perkins has argued, every Roman city was built as a statement of permanence, a miniature Rome designed to showcase the eternal nature of the empire. The street grid, the forum, the baths, the amphitheater. This was a formula for civilization that could be replicated anywhere. You could travel from York in northern Britain to Petra in the Arabian desert and find cities that were instantly recognizable and functionally similar. The economic sophistication was just as breathtaking. Lugdunum had banking houses that could issue letters of credit, allowing a merchant to deposit funds in Gaul and withdraw them in Rome. It had powerful merchant guilds, or collegia, that protected trade interests and provided social safety nets for their members. These were not just cities, they were engines of commerce and innovation. Now, I want you to appreciate the mindset required to build on this scale. Roman engineers weren't planning for next year, they were planning for the next century. The stone aqueducts were built to serve populations for generations. The roads were designed to withstand traffic that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. The public buildings were constructed with the belief that Roman civilization was the final, permanent state of human society, and for centuries it appeared they were correct. Cities like Lugdunum were not just stable, they were growing, becoming richer, and fostering innovation. A citizen of the empire in 180 AD had every reason to believe that their descendants would inhabit a world even more advanced and prosperous than their own. But this is where our narrative takes a darker turn and the true mystery begins to surface. Because all of this brilliance, all of this engineering, all of this sophisticated urban life, it all rested on foundations that were far more precarious than anyone could have imagined. What if I told you that beneath this glittering urban surface was an economic system so finely tuned and so dependent on a perfect balance of conditions that even minor shocks could set off a chain reaction of catastrophic failure? The very engine that powered these urban wonders was about to be tested in ways its designers had never foreseen. What I am about to share with you may fundamentally alter your perception of the ancient economy, because behind the magnificent Roman cities we have just explored was an economic apparatus so intricate and ruthlessly effective that it makes many modern systems seem simple. Grasping the function of this engine is not merely interesting, it is absolutely essential to understanding why it all eventually fell apart. Let me introduce you to Lucius Vettius, a fictional olive oil producer whose life is based on the realities revealed by archaeological finds like the Monte Testaccio in Rome, a massive artificial hill made almost entirely of discarded olive oil amphorae. The year is 170 AD, and Lucius, from his estate in southern Spain, has just received an order that perfectly illustrates the scale of Roman commerce. The Roman army on Hadrian's Wall in Britain needs a massive new supply of olive oil. Now, this is where the Roman economic system demonstrates its genius. Lucius doesn't think in terms of local markets. He operates on a continental scale. Within days, he has coordinated the pressing of olives from his own and neighboring estates, arranged for the production of tens of thousands of standardized clay amphorae, organized transport via Roman roads to the port of Gades, and contracted with a shipping guild to transport the oil across the Bay of Biscay and up to the shores of Britain, a journey of over 1,500 miles through multiple provinces. But here is the truly incredible part, the detail that astounds modern historians. Lucius can manage this entire transaction using a single stable currency under a unified legal code that protects his contracts and with standardized measurements for his product. Consider for a moment the complexity of a similar transaction today. How many different currencies, tax laws, and regulatory bodies would you have to navigate to move a product from rural Spain to northern England? The Romans had solved these problems 2 millennia ago. The sheer volume of this economic machine is hard to comprehend. Analysis of shipwrecks and port records suggests the Roman Empire's total annual trade volume was in the tens of millions of tons. To give you a sense of scale, the amount of grain shipped from North Africa and Egypt to Rome each year was enough to feed over 1 million people. The Romans were achieving this in the 2nd century AD. Now let's dissect how this machine truly functioned, because the details are where the brilliance lies. The bedrock of it all was the Roman road system, a network of over 50,000 miles of paved all-weather highways, supplemented by another 200,000 miles of secondary roads. But these were not mere dirt tracks. According to engineering analysis by scholars like Professor Isaac Moreno Gallo, Roman roads were sophisticated structures. They were built with deep foundations layered with different sizes of stone, engineered with a crown for drainage, and equipped with milestones, bridges, and tunnels. A merchant could travel the 900 miles from Byzantium to Rome in about 50 days. In the Middle Ages, the same journey could take 3 times as long, if it were even possible. Speed and reliability were the cornerstones of Roman economic dominance. But the true genius lay in the financial infrastructure. The Romans had developed systems we would recognize as corporate law, international banking, and risk insurance. A merchant in Ephesus could make a deposit and receive a letter of credit that could be redeemed by a partner in Gaul, eliminating the need to transport heavy and risky chests of coins. They had forms of maritime insurance, where an investor would fund a voyage in exchange for a high-interest return, but would lose their investment if the ship was lost at sea, a system known as the funus nauticum. Let me provide a concrete example that illustrates this sophistication. In the Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus, archaeologists unearthed a trove of papyrus documents. Among them was a business contract from the 2nd century AD detailing a loan for a trading venture. The contract specifies the interest rate, the repayment schedule, the collateral, and the penalties for default. It is a legally complex document that would not look out of place in a modern law office. This level of commercial security would not be seen again in most of Europe until the Italian Renaissance. The degree of economic specialization was equally remarkable. Take the region around the Bay of Naples. By the 2nd century AD, this area had become the ancient world's premier producer of luxury glassware. According to research by Professor Ian Freestone at University College London, chemical analysis shows that glass from this region was exported as far as India and the Kushan Empire in modern-day Afghanistan. The entire regional economy was geared toward this single, high-value export, or consider the massive pottery works at La Graufasank in southern Gaul. Modern archaeological estimates suggest this site produced tens of millions of pieces of high-quality red gloss pottery, known as Samian ware. This was not a local craft shop, this was an industrial-scale factory with organized labor, quality control, and a distribution network that reached from Scotland to the Sahara. And here is a detail that truly highlights the interconnectedness of the Roman economy: the wine trade. Wine was not just a drink, it was a staple of the Roman diet, consumed by everyone from soldiers to slaves. To meet this demand, certain regions became massive, specialized wine producers. Amphorae from southern Spain, Gaul, and the Aegean have been found at military forts along the German and British frontiers. Professor Roberta Tomber's research at the British Museum has traced these trade routes with incredible precision, showing how products from one corner of the empire supplied another. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Roman economic engine was its urban-centric nature. Unlike later medieval economies, which were predominantly agrarian, Roman prosperity was generated and concentrated in its cities. Urban centers were not just places of consumption, they were hubs of manufacturing, finance, innovation, and trade that powered the entire imperial system. The tax system that supported all this was just as sophisticated and just as unforgiving. The Roman state often outsourced tax collection to private corporations called publicani. These companies would bid for the right to collect taxes in a province, paying the state a lump sum up front. They then had the right to keep any surplus they could collect. It was an incredibly efficient system for the state, but it often led to brutal exploitation in the provinces. But this is where the story gets interesting, and it is vital for understanding what happens next. This entire economic marvel rested on three non-negotiable pillars: the Pax Romana, Roman peace, which guaranteed political stability, the overwhelming power of the legions, which secured the trade routes, and a steadily growing population which provided both labor and consumer markets. For more than 2 centuries, the system seemed unbreakable. Cities grew, trade expanded, wealth accumulated, and the standard of living for many urban dwellers reached a level that would not be matched in Europe for another 100 years. The urban middle class could enjoy public entertainment, heated homes, running water, and a diverse diet that was better than that of many medieval nobles. But economic systems, no matter how powerful, are only as strong as the assumptions they are built on. And those 3 pillars I mentioned, peace, security, and growth, were about to be shaken to their very foundations. Because while our fictional merchant Lucius Vettius was profiting from his olive oil trade, forces were gathering beyond the empire's borders that would soon shatter this economic paradise. And the first signs of fracture were about to appear in the most unexpected ways, threatening not just private fortunes, but the very basis of urban life itself. The year was 376 AD, and if you were a Roman official stationed on the Danube frontier, you would have seen something that defied all precedent and understanding. Throngs of people, a nation on the move, tens of thousands of Goths, men, women, and children with their carts and their herds, were gathered on the far bank of the river. They were not an invading army. They were a tide of desperate refugees pleading for entry into the empire. Now, what makes this moment so critical and so tragic is that these were not the savage barbarians of popular imagination. The Goths had been Rome's neighbors for a century. Many had served as auxiliary troops in the Roman army. Their leaders were familiar with Roman culture, and their economy was deeply intertwined with the empire through trade. They were fleeing a new and terrifying force that had appeared out of the east, a force so fearsome they were willing to abandon everything they had ever known. They were running from the Huns. And if you think you know the story of Attila, prepare to reconsider, because the reality of the Hunnic migration was a far more complex and destabilizing force than any simple invasion. Let me paint a more accurate picture of what was happening on Rome's northern borders in the late 4th century. For generations, Rome had managed its neighbors with a masterful policy of divide and rule, using a combination of diplomacy, trade subsidies, military threats, and the enlistment of barbarian warriors into its own army. It was a complex and delicate geopolitical game, but the arrival of the Huns from the Central Asian steppes was not a move in the game. It was an event that overturned the entire board. The Huns were not just another tribe, they were a catalyst for a massive continent-wide displacement of peoples. Imagine a storm front sweeping across a landscape, not just causing damage itself, but forcing everything in its path to move. According to research by Professor Peter Heather, the Hunnic advance set off a domino effect, displacing dozens of tribal groups and sending shockwaves of instability across Europe. Now, this is where most popular accounts get the story wrong. The barbarian invasions were not typically sudden, coordinated assaults by savage hordes bent on destruction. The reality was often a much slower, more complex process that was, in many ways, more damaging to the fabric of Roman urban life. Consider the famous Vandal sack of Rome in 455 AD. This was not a random act of savagery. The Vandal king, Gaiseric, was a shrewd political operator who had established a kingdom in North Africa. His attack on Rome was the culmination of a political dispute with the Roman emperor, and while the Vandals did plunder the city of its transportable wealth over a period of 2 weeks, historical sources like Prosper of Aquitaine suggest that there was no general massacre or burning of buildings. The physical damage to the city was limited, but here is the crucial point. These dramatic events were not the cause of urban decay. They were symptoms of a system that was already failing. The real harm to Roman cities was not done in spectacular sieges that make for good movie scenes. It was a slow, creeping paralysis that attacked the economic and administrative systems that were a city's lifeblood. Let me take you to Sirmium in modern-day Serbia to illustrate what I mean. In 350 AD, it was one of the 4 capitals of the Roman Empire, a magnificent city with an imperial palace, a mint, and a population of nearly 100,000. Archaeological work led by Dr. Ivana Popovic shows the city at the height of its power, but by 441 AD, the Huns sacked a city that was already a shadow of its former self. What had happened in the intervening years? No single great disaster. Instead, a steady decay. The constant threat of raids from across the Danube disrupted agriculture in the surrounding countryside. This meant the city's food supply became precarious and its tax base shrank. Imperial administration became focused on military emergencies rather than civic maintenance. Trade routes that had brought goods from across the empire became too dangerous. Here is a specific example that perfectly illustrates this process. In the early 5th century, a confederation of Germanic tribes, the Suebi, Vandals, and Alans, crossed into Spain, but they didn't march on the major cities to lay siege. Instead, they carved out territories for themselves in the countryside. For the local farmers, this might have simply meant paying taxes to a new Germanic lord instead of a Roman official. But for cities like Hispalis, Seville, and Cordoba, this was a death blow. Cities depended entirely on the agricultural surplus of the countryside. They depended on rural taxes to fund public services like aqueduct maintenance. They depended on rural populations as a market for their manufactured goods. When barbarian groups took control of the countryside and began operating outside the Roman imperial system, the cities began to suffocate, not from direct attack, but from economic starvation. Imagine if all the supply chains to your city were cut, the tax revenue from surrounding areas stopped, and the regional market for your city's products vanished. How long could your city survive? The psychological blow was just as severe. Roman cities were built as symbols of order, power, and eternity. Citizens identified with their city's public buildings and its connection to the vast, powerful empire. But as barbarian kingdoms began to form within Roman territory, as the imperial administration proved increasingly incapable of providing security, and as trade networks withered, faith in the urban system began to crumble. And here is a fascinating detail revealed by archaeology. In many instances, barbarian leaders actually attempted to preserve the Roman urban model. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, issued edicts for the repair of Roman public buildings and the preservation of aqueducts. According to his minister Cassiodorus, Theodoric saw himself as a custodian of Roman civilization. But, and this is the key, these barbarian rulers faced an insurmountable problem. Roman cities were incredibly complex machines that required Roman-level resources to operate. The intricate systems of taxation, long-distance trade, and specialized administration that had sustained them for centuries were broken. Once those systems fractured, even the most well-meaning barbarian king could not glue them back together. Imagine trying to operate a modern hospital with its complex supply chains, specialized equipment, and highly trained staff after the national economy, the federal government, and the international trade system have all collapsed. That is the scale of the challenge barbarian kings faced when they tried to maintain Roman cities. Some, like Ravenna under the Ostrogoths or Toledo under the Visigoths, succeeded for a time, but they were the exceptions, and even these eventually succumbed to the wider trend of simplification and decline. The tragic irony is that many barbarian leaders were not destroyers of Roman civilization. They were admirers who wanted to inherit it. They saw themselves as the new Romans, but the very process of their settlement, even when peaceful, fractured the delicate economic and administrative webs that Roman cities relied upon for their survival. And here's the fact that keeps historians awake at night. This was a one-way process. Once a city lost its economic purpose, once its population fell below the critical mass needed to maintain its infrastructure, and once its ties to the imperial network were cut, it was nearly impossible to bring it back to its former glory. The Middle Ages would eventually see the rise of a new kind of city, but it would take half a millennium. And these new urban centers would be built on entirely different principles. But the barbarian migrations, as disruptive as they were not the only crisis dismantling the Roman urban world, as Germanic groups were reshaping the political map. An even more insidious problem was eating away at the empire from within. A crisis that would attack the very medium of exchange that made urban civilization possible. Now imagine you are holding a Roman coin, a denarius from the year 190 AD. It is heavy in your hand, made of nearly pure silver. It is a symbol of stability, a piece of currency recognized and trusted from Scotland to Syria. Now imagine a coin of the same name from the year 270 AD. It feels light, flimsy. It is mostly bronze with only a thin silver wash. In just 80 years, the Roman state had effectively rendered its own currency worthless. And when money loses its meaning, the complex life of cities becomes impossible. This is the story of one of the most severe economic collapses in history, and it serves as a terrifying lesson in how even the most powerful civilizations can self-destruct. Let me take you to an imperial mint in the year 240 AD. You would witness something that would have been considered a capital crime just a generation earlier. Mint workers are taking old, pure silver coins from circulation, melting them down, and reissuing them with large amounts of cheaper metals like copper and bronze mixed in. The new silver coins they produce contain less than 50% actual silver. But the emperor has little choice. The empire is fighting wars on multiple fronts. The army's payroll is enormous, and the state's coffers are empty. How did it come to this? The answer is a destructive feedback loop that economists now call an imperial death spiral. It works like this. Military crises lead to increased spending. To meet these costs, the state raises taxes. High taxes stifle economic activity, causing tax revenues to fall. The government then resorts to devaluing its currency to pay its bills. This leads to rampant inflation, which in turn makes military and government expenses even higher. The cycle then repeats, each turn more destructive than the last. But let me show you the human side of this economic disaster. In the Roman town of Corbridge, near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a soldier in the early 3rd century carefully packed a wooden box with his life savings, over 160 gold coins, and a collection of silver items. He buried it for safekeeping, and for reasons we will never know, never returned to retrieve it. This Corbridge hoard, discovered in 1908, is a poignant testament to an era of collapsing faith in the economy. This wasn't a wealthy general's treasure. It was the savings of an ordinary person who felt safer burying his wealth in the ground than trusting it to the financial system. Archaeologists have found thousands of such hoards across the empire from this period. The statistics behind this collapse are breathtaking. According to analysis by monetary historian Kevin Butcher, the silver purity of the denarius plunged from over 80% in the time of Marcus Aurelius to less than 5% by the reign of Gallienus, a 95% devaluation in under a century. In modern terms, imagine seeing your $100 savings account become worth only $5 over the course of your adult life. But the devaluation of currency was only the start. The true economic poison was a principle known as Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. As people realized the new coins were worthless, they began to hoard the old pure silver coins. This caused the good money to vanish from circulation, leaving only the debased, valueless currency to flood the market. The psychological effect was catastrophic. For centuries, Roman currency had been the bedrock of Mediterranean commerce. Now suddenly, a farmer in Gaul might refuse to sell his grain for imperial coins, demanding payment in gold or goods instead. The entire monetary system was seizing up. Let me give you a concrete example of what this meant for daily life. In Egypt, where our best price records survive on papyrus, a measure of wheat that cost 200 drachmae in 270 AD cost over 2,000 drachmae by 300 AD and over 120,000 drachmae by 330 AD. This isn't just inflation, it is the complete annihilation of value. And this is where the story turns truly tragic for Roman cities. Urban populations were utterly dependent on a functioning monetary economy. A farmer could eat what he grew, but a craftsman in a city needed to buy food with cash. When that cash became worthless, urban life ground to a halt. Take the city of Ephesus in Turkey. In 200 AD, it was a bustling commercial hub. Archaeological evidence reveals a city with vibrant markets and ongoing public construction. But as the currency crisis deepened, long-distance trade became nearly impossible. A merchant wouldn't risk a dangerous sea voyage if the money they received in payment might be worthless by the time they got home. Local craftsmen couldn't import raw materials. Construction stopped because it was impossible to budget for projects when prices were doubling every few months. By 300 AD, large parts of Ephesus were falling into disrepair, not from barbarian attack, but because the economic lifeblood of the city had simply clotted. The government's attempts to fix the problem only made things worse. Emperors issued new coins that were little more than bronze slugs with a thin silver coating, essentially engaging in official counterfeiting. The Emperor Diocletian issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, which set fixed prices for thousands of goods and services with the death penalty for violators. But you cannot defeat inflation by making it illegal. And here is a detail that shows the human toll: the decline in complex craftsmanship. For centuries, Roman artisans had produced incredibly sophisticated goods like mosaic floors and intricate jewelry. But as inflation wiped out savings and made long-term business impossible, the market for such luxuries collapsed. According to archaeologist Russell Meigs' study of inscriptions at the port of Ostia, the number of inscriptions mentioning prosperous merchant guilds drops by over 90% between 200 and 300 AD. This tells us that the urban middle class, the patrons of art, the organizers of trade, the funders of civic life, was being financially obliterated. But perhaps the most devastating blow was to the professional army. Roman soldiers weren't just a fighting force. Their salaries were a massive economic stimulus for frontier regions. A legion of 5,000 men pumped hundreds of thousands of silver denarii into the local economy each year. That money supported local farmers, merchants, and artisans. When currency devaluation made the soldiers' pay worthless, it became impossible to recruit professional Roman citizens. Who would sign up to die for money that couldn't buy a loaf of bread? The old professional legions began to dissolve. They were replaced by barbarian mercenaries, the foederati, who were not paid in cash, but in land and the right to a share of local tax revenue. Do you see the fatal loop closing? Economic collapse leads to military weakness, which allows for more barbarian incursions, which necessitates more military spending, which leads to more currency devaluation, which creates more economic collapse. The archaeological record of this disaster is undeniable. Hoards of buried coins from this era have been found in nearly every province of the empire. Excavations of urban houses show a marked decline in the quality of everyday goods. The layers of soil from this period in urban sites are often what archaeologists call dark earth, indicating less economic activity and a shrinking population. But here is what makes this collapse so tragic. It was not inevitable. The empire was not running out of gold or silver. The mines in Spain and the Balkans were still productive. The problem was not fundamentally economic, it was political. The 3rd century saw a period of intense political instability, with emperors being assassinated one after another. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 AD, there were more than 20 recognized emperors, a period known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Each new ruler inherited an empty treasury and an unpaid army. The easiest and fastest solution was always to devalue the currency. print more money, and hope the consequences land on your successor. But the ultimate consequence was the death of Roman urbanism. And here is the lesson that should send a chill down the spine of anyone living in a complex modern economy. Once trust in a currency is destroyed by hyperinflation, it is incredibly difficult to restore. Even after Diocletian and later emperors stabilized the currency in the early 4th century, the damage was done. The urban middle class that had been the engine of Roman culture for centuries was gone. The intricate trade networks had been shattered. The economic confidence that had fueled centuries of urban investment had evaporated. But as devastating as this economic implosion was, it was converging with an even deeper transformation, a change in the very soul of the Roman world, a revolution in what people believed and how they chose to live. Here is a fact that might surprise you. At the very same time that Roman cities were being hollowed out by economic failure and external threats, the empire's road network was teeming with a new kind of traveler. They were not merchants hauling goods or soldiers marching to war. They were pilgrims, traveling hundreds of miles to visit the desert dwellings of ascetic holy men, carrying little more than a staff and their faith. The same infrastructure that had once bound together a commercial empire was now facilitating a movement that led people away from cities altogether. Welcome to one of history's most profound spiritual and psychological shifts, the moment an entire civilization began to question whether urban life itself was a worthy goal. Imagine yourself in the year 390 AD, standing at a crossroads. One path leads into the still grand city of Milan, the imperial capital at the time, with its massive public buildings, its chariot races, and its bustling markets, all symbols of a millennium of Roman achievement. The other path leads into the countryside towards small, emerging communities dedicated to a new ideal, Christian monasticism, which self-consciously rejected the wealth, ambition, and worldliness that the city represented. Which path would you take? For a growing number of the empire's best and brightest, the answer was no longer obvious. Let me tell you the story of Melania the Younger, because her life perfectly illustrates this seismic shift. Melania was born into one of the wealthiest aristocratic families in the entire Roman Empire. She owned vast estates in Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and Spain. In the year 400 AD, she was the epitome of the Roman elite, living a life of unimaginable luxury in a palace in Rome. Then, around the year 405 AD, she did something that scandalized her peers. She and her husband Penianus decided to give it all away. They systematically liquidated their enormous fortune, selling off villas, estates, and thousands of slaves, and donated the proceeds to the church and the poor. They then embarked on a new life of asceticism, founding monasteries in North Africa and the Holy Land. The woman who could have financed an army chose instead to live a life of prayer and service. Was Melania an outlier, or was she at the vanguard of a profound change in Roman values? According to the groundbreaking work of historian Peter Brown, Melania was part of a widespread movement. Across the empire, members of the educated elite were renouncing their urban lives and fortunes for a new kind of existence. This wasn't simply a retreat to a country villa for a holiday. This was a permanent and public rejection of the very values, wealth, status, civic participation that had defined Roman civilization for centuries. Think about what this signified. For 1,000 years, to be Roman was to be urban. Barbarians lived in forests. Civilized people lived in cities with theaters, libraries, and law courts. But now, suddenly, The new heroes of society were desert fathers living in caves, monks who embraced manual labor, and aristocratic women who chose poverty over power. The growth of this movement was explosive. According to monastery historian Marilyn Dunn, the number of monastic communities in the Eastern Empire grew from a handful in the early 4th century to thousands by the end of the 5th. Each of these monasteries was more than a religious retreat. It was an alternative society, a new model for how humans could live together. Instead of the city's frantic competition, they offered a community of cooperation. Instead of a focus on material wealth, they prized spiritual growth. But what makes this shift so compelling is that it was not just a religious phenomenon. It was a response to a deep-seated disillusionment with what urban life had become. Let me take you to the monastery of Saint-Martin at Marmoutier, founded near the city of Tours in Gaul around 372 AD. Its founder, Martin of Tours, was another Roman aristocrat who abandoned a promising career for a life of faith. But Marmoutier was not a primitive hideaway. It became a sophisticated intellectual and spiritual center that offered a powerful alternative to the decaying city nearby. The monastery had a library that preserved classical and Christian texts, a school that educated the next generation of leaders, workshops for producing manuscripts, and a guest house that provided charity and care for the poor and sick. As described in the biography by Sulpicius Severus, the community was economically self-sustaining, intellectually rigorous, and socially cohesive. It was, in effect, a new kind of city, one built on spiritual principles rather than commercial or political ones. And here is the critical point. People were choosing this life not out of desperation, but out of a conviction that traditional urban life had become morally and spiritually bankrupt. Roman cities in the late 4th and 5th centuries were often places of extreme inequality, political violence, and economic uncertainty. The grand public amenities, the baths, the theaters, were falling into disrepair or had become venues for what many Christians saw as decadent and immoral spectacles. In contrast, monastic communities offered something the old Roman world no longer could: a sense of security, a shared purpose, and a community of equals. In a world of political assassinations, barbarian raids, and currency collapse, the disciplined and predictable life of the monastery began to look less like an escape from civilization and more like its last refuge. The psychological consequences of this shift cannot be overstated. For centuries, a Roman's identity was tied to their city, their membership in a trade guild, their family's history of civic patronage, their participation in public festivals. But Christianity proposed a radically different source of identity: membership in a universal community of believers, a focus on eternal salvation rather than worldly success, and a duty to serve God before the emperor. This was more than a change of religion. It was a fundamental rewiring of what it meant to be a person in society. Romans began to value different things, pursue different ambitions, and build their lives around a completely new set of principles. Let me give you a concrete example of how this played out. In the late 4th century, the city of Rome itself faced a crisis. The imperial court had moved to Ravenna, the city's population was shrinking, and its massive infrastructure was becoming impossible to maintain. The traditional pagan aristocratic response would have been to fund a new public building or a round of gladiatorial games to boost civic pride. Instead, a new pattern emerged. Wealthy Christian aristocrats, like the family of St. Paula, began to use their fortunes to convert their urban palaces into churches, hospices for the poor, and hostels for pilgrims. They were actively disinvesting from the old civic infrastructure and reinvesting in a new Christian-centric urban landscape. The city wasn't just emptying out, it was being spiritually repurposed from the inside out. This pattern was repeated across the empire. In Antioch, a city once famous for its luxury and entertainment, massive numbers of people were drawn to the ascetic communities in the nearby Syrian desert. In Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, many of the brightest students and scholars were turning away from the classical pagan schools to join Christian monasteries and theological centers. Historian Chris Wickham has termed this process voluntary deurbanization, where the elite chose to abandon the urban lifestyle long before it was physically destroyed. But most importantly, this movement was fundamentally altering the physical appearance and function of cities. Traditional Roman cities were built around public spaces funded by a competitive elite seeking status. But Christian ethics taught that true status came from humility and charity. So instead of funding a new temple or theater, a wealthy Christian would fund a hospital for the sick, an orphanage, or a food distribution program for the poor. The urban landscape began to physically transform. Churches rose where temples once stood. Monasteries were built over the ruins of abandoned villas. The city itself was being remade to reflect a completely new set of values. Have you ever tried to imagine what it would feel like to live through such a fundamental re-evaluation of your entire culture's values? To see everything your ancestors built and cherished be redefined as misguided or even sinful? The archaeological record of this transformation is stark. Across the former empire, the pattern is the same. The last phase of construction on Roman public buildings like forums and baths dates to the mid-4th century, while new investment pours into Christian structures like churches and baptistries throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. But here is what makes this story so poignant. The people who chose the monastic life were not in their own minds abandoning civilization. They were trying to build a better, more durable version of it. From their perspective, the classical Roman city had become corrupt, unjust, and spiritually dead. The monastery was an attempt to preserve the best of Roman culture, its learning, its discipline, its organizational genius, while placing it on a more stable, spiritual foundation. And in many ways, they were successful. For centuries, when urban life in Western Europe reached its lowest ebb, it was the monasteries that preserved literacy, classical texts, and advanced agricultural techniques. But the spiritual revolution was about to collide with a more tangible crisis, a challenge that would attack the physical skeleton of the Roman world and make the old urban model impossible to sustain. There is something truly mind-boggling that most people fail to grasp about the Roman road network. These roads were not simply surfaces for travel, they were the circulatory system of an entire civilization. When that system began to fail, the whole body of Roman urban life started to suffer a catastrophic stroke. And the story of how the world's most advanced road system fell into disuse is one of the most compelling examples of how the collapse of infrastructure can bring a civilization to its knees. Imagine standing on the Via Egnatia in the year 250 AD, the great highway that connected the western and eastern halves of the Roman Empire, stretching from the Adriatic coast to Byzantium. You would witness a constant flow of traffic, legions marching to the Persian frontier, imperial couriers carrying official correspondence, caravans of silk from the east, and marble from Greek quarries. Now visualize that same road in the year 500 AD. The meticulously laid paving stones are gone, scavenged for local buildings. A major bridge is out, forcing travelers to make a dangerous river crossing. A section of the road has been washed away by a landslide and never repaired. What was once a high-speed artery of empire has become a perilous local track. How could this happen? How does a transportation network that was the envy of the world simply fall apart? The answer reveals a profound truth about civilization. It depends on systems of maintenance that are often invisible until they are gone. Let me take you inside the complex world of Roman road administration, because understanding this system is key to appreciating the disaster of its collapse. Roman roads were not a build it and forget it affair. They required continuous, organized, and well-funded maintenance. Every major highway was overseen by a curator viarum, a high-ranking official who was essentially a regional highway administrator. This was a serious engineering and logistical job. According to inscriptional evidence gathered by Professor Raymond Chevalier, these curators commanded large teams of surveyors, engineers, stonemasons, and laborers. The funding for this was equally sophisticated. Research by transportation historian Ann Kolb indicates that the maintenance of the primary road network consumed a significant portion of the imperial budget, comparable to what modern nations spend on their highway systems. But here is the critical distinction. Roman roads were part of a unified, centrally managed system. Taxes collected in a wealthy province like Egypt could be used to fund road repairs on the German frontier. The entire network was seen as a single, vital imperial asset. But as we have seen, this entire centralized system was disintegrating by the late 4th century. Barbarian settlements in the countryside disrupted the collection of taxes. The endless cycle of civil wars diverted funds from infrastructure to the military. The economic collapse meant there was simply less money available for anything. And this is where the story of the roads turns tragic. As soon as the centralized maintenance stopped, the network began to decay with shocking speed. Let me show you precisely how this occurred, using the example of the Fosse Way, a major Roman road that ran diagonally across Britain for over 200 miles. Built in the 1st century AD, this highway was a vital commercial and military artery for over 300 years. Archaeological investigations by Dr. Pierre Cillier show that Roman engineering was brilliant. The roads were built in layers with deep foundations and drainage ditches to keep the surface dry. But when the Roman legions and administration withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the maintenance stopped. Without regular clearing, the drainage ditches clogged with silt and vegetation, causing water to undermine the road's foundation. The heavy paving stones were a valuable source of building material for local leaders who began to quarry the roads for their own projects. Without repairs to bridges, they were eventually washed away in winter floods. By the 6th century, large stretches of the Fosse Way had vanished, becoming little more than a memory in the landscape. Now imagine trying to maintain your country's interstate highway system with no federal funding, no state departments of transportation, and no professional engineering corps. That is precisely what happened to the Roman road network. The economic consequences were devastating. Roman cities were designed with the assumption of cheap, fast, and reliable transport. Urban industries depended on raw materials brought from hundreds of miles away. Urban populations were fed with grain shipped from distant provinces. When the roads failed, these vital supply chains were severed. Let me give you a specific example from Aquileia. a major port city in northern Italy. For centuries, Aquileia had thrived as a hub for trade between the Mediterranean and Central Europe. Goods would arrive by sea and then be transported north over the Alps on Roman roads. But as the Alpine passes became difficult to traverse due to lack of maintenance, that trade dried up. According to archaeological analysis by Professor Armand Desbot, the city's large commercial warehouses fell into disuse in the 5th century, and the city's famous workshops, which produced fine glass and amber goods, could no longer get their raw materials or export their finished products. Aquileia, a city of over 100,000 at its peak, dwindled to a small town. It didn't die from attack. It died from logistical failure. And here is a detail that reveals the psychological impact of this collapse: the disappearance of milestones. Roman roads were marked at every Roman mile with a stone pillar, often inscribed with the distance to the next major city and the name of the reigning emperor. These were not just road signs, they were constant reminders of the presence and power of the empire. But as the roads fell into disrepair, the milestones stopped being erected. Existing ones were often toppled or reused. The archaeological record shows a near total cessation of new milestone production after the late 4th century. It was as if the empire was literally losing its way. The collapse of the roads also had a catastrophic effect on the speed of communication. The imperial postal service, the cursus publicus, was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Using a network of relay stations with fresh horses, official messengers could travel over 100 miles a day. An urgent message from the governor of Britain could reach Rome in under a month, a speed that would not be consistently matched in Europe until the 18th century. But this system was entirely dependent on well-maintained roads and staffed relay stations. As the roads decayed and the stations were abandoned, communication slowed to a crawl. According to historian Michael McCormick's research, a journey that might have taken 30 days in the 3rd century could take 90 days or more by the 5th century, if the message got through at all. Think about what this means for governing an empire. How do you respond to a military crisis when it takes 3 months for you to even hear about it? How do you maintain a unified legal system when new laws from the capital take half a year to reach the provinces? The failure of the road network also fundamentally reshaped the geography of Europe. Roman roads had been built to connect regions in a way that served the empire's economic and military logic, often cutting straight across difficult terrain. The Great Road from Milan to Cologne, for instance, involved incredible engineering to cross the Alps. But when these engineered mountain roads were no longer maintained, the passes became unusable for much of the year. The trade link between Italy and Germany was effectively severed for centuries. Regions that had been part of an integrated continental economy became isolated. Europe began to break apart into the smaller, localized geographic units that would define the Middle Ages. Perhaps most tragically, the advanced knowledge of Roman road engineering was almost entirely lost. The techniques for building multi-layered all-weather roads that could last for centuries were forgotten. When Europeans began to build major roads again in the early modern period, they essentially had to reinvent the science. In many ways, Europe did not fully recover from the collapse of the Roman road network until the coming of the railway. But the failure of the roads was only one part of a wider infrastructure crisis that was making Roman cities unlivable. While engineers were fighting a losing battle to keep the highways open, an even more fundamental threat was emerging, one that would strike at the very source of urban health and life. Just when it seems the story could not get any bleaker, a new antagonist enters the stage: one that makes barbarian armies seem manageable by comparison. It was silent, it traveled invisibly along the empire's remaining trade routes, and it killed with terrifying efficiency. But this enemy was not human, it was a bacterium. And when the Justinianic Plague erupted across the Mediterranean in 541 AD, it did more than just kill millions of people. It shattered the fundamental belief that cities were humanity's safest refuge. Let me paint a scene that will haunt your imagination. It is the spring of 542 AD in the city of Constantinople, the largest and most magnificent city in the late Roman world, a metropolis of 500,000 people. The day begins as any other. The great markets are filled with goods from across the known world. The construction of the new Hagia Sophia Cathedral is nearing completion, and the city hums with the energy of empire. But then people begin to develop fevers. Swellings called buboes appear in their groins and armpits. By evening, the city's mood has shifted from confidence to fear. Within a week, the fear has become outright terror. The city that had been the center of the world becomes a giant tomb. The historian Procopius, who was in the city and witnessed the horror firsthand, tells us that at the plague's height, the death toll reached 10,000 people per day. Let that number sink in, 10,000 deaths every single day. The government ran out of places to bury the dead. Bodies were stacked in the streets, loaded onto unmanned boats and pushed out to sea or dumped into the fortified towers along the city walls. But what makes this pandemic so crucial to our story is not just the death toll, but how it specifically targeted the foundations of urban society. The way it spread reveals a terrifying paradox. The very interconnectedness that had made the Roman world so prosperous also made it catastrophically vulnerable. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, arrived in the Roman world on grain ships from Egypt, carried by infected fleas, hosted by black rats that infested the ship's holds. This was the dark side of globalization. The same imperial grain fleet that fed Constantinople's massive population was now delivering a biological catastrophe to its doorstep. Let me take you into the mind of someone who lived through this apocalypse. Evagrius Scholasticus, a historian in Antioch, survived the plague, but wrote a heart-wrenching account of its effects. He describes how the plague returned to his city again and again throughout his life, killing his wife, several of his children, and most of his servants and friends. But what is most striking in his account is the utter collapse of social functions. The law courts fell silent because the lawyers and judges were dead. The markets emptied because the farmers were too afraid to bring their goods into the city. The military could not recruit new soldiers. According to Evagrius, the basic machinery of government simply ceased to operate because there was no one left to run it. And here are the horrifying statistics behind this disaster. Modern demographic historians like Dr. Lester Little, analyzing the available evidence, estimate that the first wave of the Justinianic Plague killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population of the Roman Empire. This is not a public health crisis, it is a demographic event on a scale not seen again until the Black Death 800 years later. But the true tragedy for urban life was not the initial wave of death. It was how the plague fundamentally and permanently altered the relationship between people and cities. For 1,000 years, the prevailing wisdom had been that cities offered safety. They had walls for defense, organized food supplies to prevent famine, and were seen as centers of civilization. But the plague taught a brutal lesson. Dense urban populations were a perfect breeding ground for disease.
If you were a farmer in an isolated rural village when the plague struck a nearby city, your chances of survival were relatively high. But if you were living in a crowded urban apartment block, you were in a death trap with no escape. The psychological wound was deep and lasting. Professor Kyle Harper, in his analysis of the literature from this period, shows a dramatic shift in how people wrote about cities. Before the plague, cities were celebrated as symbols of human power and ingenuity. After the plague, they are often depicted as cursed places of cesspools of sin and disease that attracted God's wrath. This was not mere superstition, it was a rational response to lived experience. The plague did not just strike once, it became endemic, returning in devastating waves every decade or so for the next 2 centuries. Records show major outbreaks hitting Constantinople in 542, 558, 573, and so on well into the 8th century. Imagine being a city planner under these conditions. How can you invest in a new aqueduct or public building when you know that a quarter of your population might be dead in 10 years? How can you maintain the specialized guilds of craftsmen needed for a complex urban economy when entire trades could be wiped out in a single season? Let me show you precisely how this played out in the city of Rome. Before the plague, even in its reduced state, Rome was still a major urban center with a population of perhaps 50,000 to 100,000. The city was still functioning, but the plague hit Rome hard in 583 AD and returned again and again. The demographic shock was so severe that the city could no longer support even basic services. According to the Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes, the population fell so low that large areas within the ancient Aurelian walls were turned into farmland and pastures. The remaining population clustered in a few small areas, leaving the magnificent ruins of the imperial city to crumble. The economic fallout was equally severe. Roman urban economies relied on a critical mass of people to support specialized professions. Take something as fundamental as medicine. Roman cities had highly trained doctors and public hospitals. But when the plague killed the doctors faster than new ones could be trained, that sophisticated medical knowledge was lost. Archaeological evidence from across the former empire shows a decline in the quality of surgical instruments found in sites post-dating the plague. Europe would not recover the level of medical sophistication seen in the Roman world for centuries. The same process occurred in countless other specialized trades. The knowledge required for making complex concrete, for engineering long-span bridges, for producing high-quality blown glass, all of this was held by a relatively small number of trained professionals. When the plague wiped them out, that knowledge was often lost forever. Perhaps most devastatingly, the plague reversed the demographic engine that had powered Roman urbanism for centuries. Roman cities had always depended on a steady stream of migrants from the countryside, young people seeking fame, fortune, or simply a better life. This constant migration compensated for the naturally high death rates in pre-modern cities. But the plague turned cities from magnets of opportunity into centers of death. Why would any rational young person leave the relative safety of their rural village to move to a city where they were much more likely to die of disease? The centuries-long flow of people from the countryside to the city that had built the Roman world simply stopped. Professor Peter Saris at Cambridge University has argued that the total population of the former Roman Empire did not return to its pre-plague levels until perhaps the 12th century, a demographic depression that lasted for over 500 years. But the plague's impact was more than just demographic. It changed how survivors saw the world.
The confident, optimistic, and human-centric worldview of classical Roman culture was shattered. In its place grew a more fatalistic and otherworldly perspective. Religious writings from the post-plague era are filled with apocalyptic imagery. Instead of investing in civic projects for this world, people were encouraged to prepare their souls for the next. Do you see how this converges with the spiritual revolution we discussed earlier? The plague didn't just kill Romans, it killed their faith in the earthly city and made the promise of the city of God seem all the more urgent and real. But even as the cities of the Mediterranean were reeling from this biological catastrophe, new social and political forces were coalescing that would reshape the landscape of Europe and render the old Roman urban model truly obsolete. But hold on, there's a surprising plot twist in our story. As Roman cities were being ravaged by plague, economic failure, and political fragmentation, a completely new and different way of organizing society was quietly taking root in the countryside. It would create a world where large cities were not only unnecessary, but in many ways undesirable. It was called feudalism, and it represented one of the most fundamental reorganizations of power and society in European history. Picture this. It is the year 500 AD, and you are the head of a moderately wealthy family in what used to be Roman Gaul. Your family has lived in the city of Burdigala, Bordeaux, for generations, profiting from the wine trade, but the city is a shadow of its former self. The trade routes are cut, the currency is unreliable, and the city administration can no longer guarantee your safety. Now, a local Frankish warlord makes you a proposition. He controls the surrounding countryside and has a large band of armed followers. He offers to guarantee your family's safety, protect your lands from raiders, and provide a stable supply of food from his estates. All you have to do in return is abandon your dangerous city home, move your family to his fortified rural estate, and pledge your personal loyalty and service to him, not to some powerless, distant emperor. What choice would you make? For more and more of the remaining Roman elite, the choice was simple: you take the deal. This is the story of how Europe, out of necessity, stumbled upon a new social order that would make Roman-style cities irrelevant for the next 500 years. Let me clarify what feudalism really was, because it's a term that is often misunderstood. Feudalism was not a grand political theory somebody invented. It was a grassroots emergency response to the collapse of central authority. It was a practical, ad hoc solution to the fundamental problem of how to provide security and organize society when the state can no longer do its job. Here is how it worked. In the absence of reliable state institutions, power became personal. Instead of relying on an abstract concept like Roman citizenship, people formed direct, personal bonds with powerful local leaders who could offer protection. These were not mere employment contracts. They were solemn oaths of loyalty. Powerful individual, a lord, would grant a piece of land, a fief, to a follower, a vassal. In exchange for the land and the lord's protection, the vassal swore an oath to provide military service and other duties to the lord. The brilliance of the system was its scalability and resilience. Unlike the Roman imperial system, which needed a massive bureaucracy and a complex tax system to function, feudal bonds could organize society at any level. A handful of families could have a feudal arrangement with a local knight. A group of knights could be vassals to a regional duke. You didn't need cities, paved roads, or a functioning currency to make feudalism work. Let me show you how this transformation played out on the ground. Using the example of Italy, in the 6th and 7th centuries after the Lombard invasion. According to research by historian Chris Wickham, archaeological surveys show a profound change in how people lived. The old Roman villas, which were centers of commercial agriculture, were either abandoned or more often transformed into fortified settlements known as castra. These became the new centers of power. But here is the fascinating part. This was not simply a story of decay. In many areas, agricultural productivity for local consumption may have actually been quite stable. Why? Because a local Lombard duke had a direct personal interest in making his land as productive as possible to support his followers in a way that an absentee Roman senator living hundreds of miles away never did. Consider the writings of Pope Gregory the Great from the late 6th century. His letters provide a detailed picture of a world where Roman institutions have vanished. He doesn't write to Roman governors, he writes to local Lombard dukes and bishops, negotiating for the protection of towns and the release of captives. Power has become local and personal. You can see the revolutionary implications. For the first time in nearly a millennium, Europeans were demonstrating that it was possible to have security, social order, and a productive economy without relying on large urban centers at all. The shift in social psychology was immense. Roman civilization was built on the idea that status was derived from one's role in the city, holding public office, sponsoring games, having a grand house in town. But feudalism created an entirely new value system centered on land ownership and personal loyalty. A feudal lord's power came not from winning an election, but from the number of armed vassals who had sworn an oath to him. His wealth came not from trade or finance, but from the agricultural output of his lands. His social standing depended not on his civic contributions, but on his martial reputation and his ability to protect his people. This wasn't just a new political system, it was a new way of defining a successful human life. Let me give you a specific example of this process. In the 8th century, the Frankish ruler Charles Martel needed to fund a powerful cavalry force to fight Islamic invaders. But there was no functioning tax system to pay for this army. So he did something revolutionary. He seized large tracts of land from the church and granted them as fiefs to his most powerful warriors. As described in the Frankish Chronicles, each warrior was given enough land to support himself, his family, and his expensive war horse. They built fortified manors, organized the local peasants into a workforce, and created self-sufficient economic units that had little need for cities. The city of Paris at this time did not disappear, but its economic function was drastically reduced. It was primarily an administrative and religious center. Why would a Frankish warrior travel to a dangerous city to buy a sword or a shield when he could have his own blacksmiths on his own estate make them for him? The archaeological record of this transformation is unmistakable. Excavations across Western Europe show the emergence of a new type of settlement, the fortified manor or the early Motte-and-Bailey castle, surrounded by peasant villages. These were not just forts, they were the new centers of political, economic, and social life. Professor Thomas Bisson at Harvard has documented how thousands of these local power centers emerged across Europe between the 5th and 8th centuries. Each one represented a deliberate turning away from the urban model of the Roman world and towards something new. But perhaps most critically, feudalism changed how Europeans conceived of power itself. Roman power was institutional and abstract. The emperor had authority because of the office he held. Feudal power was tangible and personal.
A lord commanded loyalty because of a personal oath sworn to him by his vassal. This had massive consequences for society. Roman cities were run by a class of professional administrators. Feudal territories were governed through face-to-face negotiations between lords and their vassals. The economic consequences were just as profound. The Roman economy was based on specialization and long-distance trade. The feudal economy was based on local self-sufficiency. A feudal manor aimed to produce everything it needed: food, clothing, tools, weapons. The result was what the great historian Henri Pirenne famously called the economy of no outlets, a world of closed regional economic systems that did not depend on external trade. It was the complete antithesis of the interconnected, specialized economy that had been the hallmark of Roman urbanism. And here is a detail that shows how complete this shift was. In many parts of Europe, coinage almost completely disappeared from daily use. Feudal obligations were paid not in cash, but in kind. A certain number of days of labor, a certain amount of grain, a certain number of chickens. Archaeological sites from this period in Northern Europe show a dramatic drop in the number of coins found, not because people were necessarily poorer, but because they were living in a largely moneyless economy. By the 8th century, much of Western Europe had, in a sense, returned to a pre-Roman way of life, a landscape of small, self-sufficient agricultural communities ruled by a warrior elite with little need for large cities or long-distance trade. It was as if the entire Roman urban experiment had been put on hold. But this new feudal world was about to be impacted by yet another massive geopolitical shift, a force rising from the east that would redraw the map of the Mediterranean and cut the final ties to the old Roman world. Everything changed on a fateful day in 622 AD, when a merchant named Muhammad embarked on a journey from Mecca to Medina, a journey that would ignite a movement that would utterly transform the world's economic geography. But here is the critical point that is often missed. The rise of Islam did not just create a new empire, it fundamentally reconfigured the ancient trade networks that had been the lifeblood of Roman civilization for 1,000 years. And when those roots were rewired, the last tenuous connections linking the struggling cities of Europe to the wider world were severed. Imagine you are a Christian merchant in the great port of Alexandria in the year 640 AD. You see Arab armies on the horizon. You might assume this is just another in a long line of invaders, like the Persians who had recently occupied the city. But you would be profoundly mistaken. These were not just conquerors seeking tribute, they were the vanguard of a new dynamic civilization that would create a unified commercial zone stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of China. In less than a century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islamic forces had conquered an empire larger than Rome's at its height. But unlike the Germanic tribes in the West, the Arabs did not simply preside over a system in decline. They created a vibrant new economic system, and in doing so, they dealt a final decisive blow to the remnants of Roman urbanism in Europe. Here is how the decline of cities in our story becomes fascinating. The Islamic conquest did not end Mediterranean trade. They reoriented it. And for the languishing cities of Christian Europe, this reorientation was an economic catastrophe. Let me show you exactly how this worked, using the trade in spices as an example. For centuries, the Roman world had been fueled by a powerful craving for spices from the east: pepper from India, cloves from the Spice Islands, cinnamon from Ceylon. These were not just flavorings, they were vital for medicine and food preservation. And this trade had made cities like Alexandria and Antioch incredibly wealthy. But when the Arab conquests created a unified Islamic world, they also created new, more efficient trade routes. Arab and Persian sailors mastered the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, establishing direct trade links with India and beyond. The result was what economic historian Michael McCormick has called a great commercial reorientation. Instead of flowing north and west across the Mediterranean to European ports, the wealth of the East now flowed into the great new cities of the Islamic world, Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. European cities, which had once been the wealthy middlemen in this trade, were now cut out of the loop. Why would a spice merchant from India undertake the dangerous and fragmented journey to a poor European town when the booming markets of Baghdad offered better prices, a stable gold-based currency, and a unified legal system? Let me give you a concrete example of how devastating this could be. For centuries, the city of Naples in southern Italy had been a major hub for trade with North Africa and the Levant. It imported Egyptian grain, North African olive oil, and Syrian glassware, but archaeological excavations in Naples, led by Professor Michel Bonifay, show a dramatic change in the 7th and 8th centuries. The distinctive pottery from North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, which is found in abundance in earlier layers, almost completely vanishes. The city's trade connections have been severed. Construction of major public works ceases. Naples does not die, but it shrinks dramatically, turning inward to become a small, regional center. Its economic foundation as a hub of international trade had been pulled out from under it. And here is the great historical irony. Just as the cities of Christian Europe were entering their darkest period, the Islamic world was experiencing a massive urban renaissance. The new city of Baghdad, founded in 762 AD, quickly grew to become the largest city in the world, with a population approaching 1 million people, larger than Rome had ever been. Cities like Cordoba in Spain, Palermo in Sicily, and Cairo in Egypt became magnificent centers of commerce, learning, and science. These were not primitive towns. They were sophisticated metropolises with features that would have been unimaginable in contemporary Europe. Cordoba in the 10th century had paved and lighted streets, hundreds of public baths, dozens of libraries, and a level of public health that was centuries ahead of Paris or London. Imagine the psychological effect this had on the few European travelers who witnessed it. For a millennium, civilization had meant Rome and its heirs. Now suddenly the world's most advanced and prosperous cities belonged to a rival civilization. This commercial reorientation also had a profound impact on the availability of goods in Europe. Products that had been common in the Roman era, papyrus for writing, silk clothing, exotic spices, now became incredibly rare and fantastically expensive luxuries, available only to kings and high-ranking clergy. This forced European society to become even more localized and self-sufficient, which further diminished the need for cities. If you can't buy fine cloth from the city anyway, why not just wear the rough woolen homespun made on your own estate? But perhaps most importantly, the Islamic world created a new scale of commerce. Roman trade was often conducted by individual merchants, but Islamic trade was frequently organized by large family firms with networks of agents spanning continents, supported by advanced financial tools like the SAC, the ancestor of the modern bank check. A merchant in Cordoba could write a SAC that could be cashed by his agent in Baghdad.
European merchants, with their fragmented markets and lack of sophisticated financial instruments, simply could not compete on this scale. The technological gap was also widening. Arab sailors were using new tools like the astrolabe for navigation and were drawing on a combined body of knowledge from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources. Islamic merchants were using advanced accounting methods and commercial law. It was like a medieval craftsman trying to compete with a modern factory. This commercial revolution also helps explain the differing fates of European regions. Areas that were most dependent on the old Mediterranean trade routes, southern Italy, southern France, Spain, suffered the most severe urban collapse. But regions that were more oriented towards the North Sea and Baltic trade, like England, northern France, and Germany, were less affected and managed to maintain a more continuous, if modest, urban tradition. The shift also explains which types of cities were more likely to survive. Cities whose primary function had been long-distance trade often withered, but cities that were important religious centers like Rome or Canterbury, or administrative centers for the new feudal kingdoms like Paris, retained a reason to exist. By 800 AD, the economic map of the world had been fundamentally remade. The interconnected Roman Mediterranean was gone, replaced by two separate and unequal economic worlds. Europe had not just lost its great cities, it had become an economic backwater. But even in this darkest hour, as urban life reached its lowest point, a few remarkable communities were discovering new and ingenious ways to survive against all odds. Against all odds, some cities simply refused to disappear, and their stories of survival are profoundly instructive because they reveal the essential ingredients of urban resilience, the secret sauce that could keep a city alive when all logic suggested it should fail. And these were not always the largest or most powerful cities of the old Roman world. They were the most clever, the most nimble, the ones that learned how to adapt and reinvent themselves for a new era. Let me share with you 3 incredible stories of survival that will completely alter your understanding of adaptation and ingenuity. First, let's look at Rome itself. The Eternal City came perilously close to becoming a ghost town. By the year 600 AD, its population had plummeted from a peak of over 1 million to perhaps 30,000 souls huddled in a few neighborhoods amidst the colossal ruins of their ancestors. The great aqueducts that had supplied the city with water were cut. The forums were being used as pastures for livestock, and the Colosseum was a crumbling wreck. But here is the miracle. Rome did not die. It underwent a radical transformation. Instead of clinging to the memory of its lost political empire, the city repurposed itself around a new kind of power, its spiritual authority as the center of Western Christianity. Under the leadership of figures like Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century, Rome essentially pivoted its entire economy. Instead of being a center for imperial administration, it became the world's first major destination for religious tourism. It no longer attracted generals and senators, it attracted pilgrims. Instead of relying on grain shipments from a lost African province, the city built a new, more sustainable economy based on servicing the thousands of visitors who flocked to pray at the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. According to historian Chris Wickham, the papacy reorganized the vast agricultural estates it controlled across Italy to supply the city, creating a new, localized economic system. Churches became the new centers of activity. Old Roman administrative buildings were converted into hostels and hospitals for pilgrims. The city's artisans began producing religious relics and souvenirs instead of imperial luxury goods.
The genius of this strategy was that it created a viable urban economy that was no longer dependent on the fragile long-distance networks of the old empire. Pilgrims were a renewable resource. Rome had invented the medieval tourism industry. Imagine the profound mental shift this required. The citizens of Rome had to let go of their identity as the rulers of the world and embrace a new one as the custodians of its spiritual heart. Now let's journey east to Constantinople, which faced an even greater existential threat. The city was a besieged island of Roman civilization in a hostile world, battered by plague and cut off from many of its traditional sources of food and wealth. By all rights, it should have followed the other great cities of antiquity into decline. Instead, Constantinople became the most successful city of the entire medieval period. How? By becoming a master of what we would today call a knowledge economy and high-tech manufacturing.
Under emperors like Leo III in the 8th century, the city pivoted away from relying on territorial empire and focused on its unique intellectual and technological assets. Byzantine scholars preserved and copied thousands of ancient Greek texts that were lost in the West. The city's workshops developed technologies that were the envy of the world, most famously Greek fire, an incendiary naval weapon that gave its navy a crushing advantage. But what really secured Constantinople's prosperity was its mastery of niche, high-value markets. While the Islamic world dominated the bulk trade in spices, Constantinople specialized in producing ultra-luxury goods that no one else could make. Byzantine artisans were the only ones outside of China who knew the secret of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms. They produced magnificent silk textiles shot through with gold thread that were so prized that foreign rulers would pay a king's ransom for them. According to economic historian Michael Hendy's analysis, the city's imperial mints produced a stable gold currency, the solidus, that was the most trusted international currency for nearly 1,000 years. The city had, in effect, become the Switzerland of the Middle Ages, a small power that thrived by focusing on high quality, high-value exports, and financial stability. But perhaps the most surprising story of survival comes from an unexpected corner of the world, the lagoon city of Venice. In the early Middle Ages, Venice was little more than a collection of muddy islands, a refuge for people fleeing invasions on the Italian mainland. It had no agricultural land, no natural resources, and no military power, yet it would become one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the world. How? By completely rethinking the purpose of a city. The Venetians pioneered a new kind of urbanism, one based not on land or military might, but exclusively on trade and maritime skill. Under the leadership of its elected doges, Venice built a commercial empire. The city's genius was twofold. First, they developed innovative business practices. They invented forms of commercial partnership, like the colleganza, which allowed investors to fund trading voyages while limiting their personal risk. This unleashed a wave of entrepreneurial energy. Second, they took a pragmatic approach to geopolitics. They built a powerful navy not to conquer large territories, but to protect their sea lanes and secure trading privileges in key ports. They traded with everyone, Byzantines, Muslims, and Western Christians, often acting as the crucial intermediary between the Islamic and Christian worlds. According to historian Frederick Lane, Venice essentially functioned as a single massive corporation, with the state actively supporting and directing commercial enterprise. Ravenna, under Theodoric, had shown how different cultures could coexist within a city.
Venice showed how a city could thrive with almost no territory at all, existing purely as a node in a global trade network. Do you see the common thread in these stories? The cities that made it through the collapse were not the ones that stubbornly tried to hold on to the past. They were the ones that adapted, innovated, and found a new reason to exist in a changed world. All three of these survivors share key traits. First, they built sustainable economic models that were not dependent on the old imperial system. Rome turned to religion, Constantinople to technology, and Venice to trade. Second, they invested in human capital, the skills, knowledge, and social organization of their people, rather than just trying to maintain old physical infrastructure. Third, they were flexible and opportunistic, constantly adapting their strategies to new geopolitical realities. Most importantly, these cities proved that urban life itself was more resilient than any single empire.
They demonstrated that cities were not merely administrative outposts. They were, at their core, dynamic concentrations of human energy and ingenuity. The lessons learned in these survivor cities would eventually radiate out across Europe, planting the seeds for the great urban revival that was to come. But before that renaissance could happen, we need to dig into the soil itself and understand what archaeologists have found about the very process of urban decay. Discoveries that have turned our entire understanding of this period on its head. Sometimes the most revolutionary truths are not found in ancient texts, but in the layers of dirt beneath our feet. For generations, the story of the fall of Roman cities was told through the words of historians who wrote of fire, destruction, and abandonment. But over the last few decades, archaeologists, with their trowels and their patient analysis of soil and artifacts, have uncovered a completely different story. And what they have found has shattered the old narratives of sudden, catastrophic collapse. The real story is stranger, slower, and far more human than we ever imagined. Let me take you on an archaeological dig that will change the way you see the end of the Roman world. Imagine you are in an excavation trench in the center of what was once Viriconium Corniviorum, the fourth largest city in Roman Britain, near modern-day Rochester. For decades, it was assumed that cities like this were violently destroyed by Saxon raiders or simply abandoned by their inhabitants who fled to the countryside. But the long-term excavations led by archaeologist Philip Barker revealed something far more complex and fascinating. Instead of a layer of ash and destruction dating to the 5th century, he found something that at first made no sense at all. Evidence of large-scale organized construction, but in wood, not stone. Here is what the archaeological record shows. In the late 4th century, Viriconium was a classic Roman city with a grand stone basilica and forum at its heart. But in the 5th century, after Roman authority had withdrawn from Britain, the inhabitants began to do something remarkable. They started to carefully dismantle the massive stone buildings, not in a chaotic act of destruction, but in an organized process to recycle the materials. And where the stone forum once stood, they built massive new public buildings using sophisticated timber framing techniques. These were not the crude huts of squatters, they were monumental wooden halls, built with a level of carpentry skill that was astonishing. Can you grasp the intelligence and pragmatism of this? The people of post-Roman Viriconium looked at their decaying stone infrastructure, realized they no longer had the economy or the specialized masons to maintain it, and made a conscious choice to switch to a new, more sustainable technology using the abundant local resource, wood. This pattern of what archaeologists call adaptive reuse is now being discovered all across the former empire.
and it is revolutionizing our view of the transition from the Roman to the medieval world. Instead of a sudden fall, the evidence points to a long, slow process of transformation and adaptation. Let me give you another, even more striking example. At the site of Caleva Atribatum, Silchester, another major Roman town in Britain, excavations led by Professor Michael Fulford have uncovered something that defies all the old historical narratives. In the area of the old Roman Forum, his team found evidence of prosperous occupation dating well into the 6th century. And here is the truly incredible part. The people living there were not impoverished survivors. They were operating sophisticated metalworking forges.
Analysis of the industrial waste or slag from these forges shows that these 6th century craftsmen were smelting iron and producing tools with a level of technical skill that was, in some respects, even more advanced than that of their Roman predecessors. Think about what that means. In the heart of what was supposed to be a dead city, a community was thriving, maintaining complex technical knowledge and likely serving a wide regional market. These were not barbarians living in ruins. They were the resourceful ancestors of medieval craftsmen. Professor Fulford's latest research suggests that this pattern of continued adapted occupation was the rule, not the exception. The cities did not simply die, they changed their form and function, but perhaps the most profound archaeological revelations have come from continental Europe, where new scientific techniques are showing that some declining Roman cities never really declined at all. They just changed in ways that made them invisible to the literary sources of the time. Take the city of Tours in central France. The 6th century writings of its famous bishop, Gregory of Tours, paint a picture of a city where life is centered almost exclusively around the church and the shrine of St. Martin. Based on his account, historians assume the old Roman city was largely abandoned, but extensive archaeological work in Tours, led by Henri Galigny, tells a very different story. Excavations have revealed that the commercial and artisanal districts of the Roman city continued to operate without a break straight through the so-called Dark Ages. They have found evidence of continuous glass production, metalworking, and trade in pottery. The archaeological evidence suggests that Tours remained a bustling town of thousands of inhabitants, with a complex economy that Gregory, in his religiously focused writings, simply never bothered to describe. So why the discrepancy? The answer reveals a critical lesson about history. Our understanding is often shaped by the biases of the people who wrote the sources. To a Christian bishop like Gregory, a city was defined by its Christian institutions. The noisy, messy, commercial life of the town was of little interest to him, so he didn't write about it. It is as if a future historian tried to understand 21st century New York by only reading the reports of the archdiocese. They would get a true but radically incomplete picture. The work of historians like Dr. Chris Wickham has shown that this clerical bias in our written sources may have created a distorted image of widespread urban collapse. The cities did not disappear. They just transformed in ways that the literary elite of the time did not value or record. But the most mind-altering discoveries have come from a place where no one thought to look, under the sea. Marine archaeologists are discovering hundreds of shipwrecks from the 5th to the 8th centuries, the very heart of the Dark Ages. And these ships are not empty. They are filled with commercial cargo, amphorae of wine and oil, stacks of pottery, and other manufactured goods.
Research by scholars like Sean Kingsley has cataloged these wrecks, revealing a vibrant network of maritime trade across the Mediterranean that was supposedly non-existent. This evidence shows that cities like Naples, Marseille, and Carthage maintained commercial links long after they were thought to be isolated. What is truly fascinating is that this trade seems to have been carried on by smaller, independent merchants sailing between smaller ports. It was a more localized and decentralized trade network than the old Roman one, and so it left fewer records in the official historical sources.
Perhaps most remarkably, recent archaeology in Eastern and Central Europe is showing that while the urban network of the Western Empire was transforming, new urban centers were actually beginning to grow in regions that had never been part of the Roman world. Excavations in Poland and the Czech Republic are revealing the emergence of large fortified settlements in the 7th and 8th centuries that were centers of craft production and long-distance trade. Professor Florin Curda at the University of Florida has argued that what we have long called the fall of Rome might be better understood as a recentering of European urbanism. The locus of economic and social innovation was shifting from the old Mediterranean core to new regions in the north and east. But here is what I find most profound about all of these archaeological discoveries. They restore a sense of agency and ingenuity to the people who lived through this period. They were not passive victims watching their world collapse. They were resourceful, intelligent people making calculated decisions about how to adapt to new circumstances. They recycled materials, adopted new technologies, and reorganized their communities in ways that made sense for their new reality. They salvaged what was best from their urban heritage while letting go of what was no longer sustainable. And this archaeological evidence forces us to ask a new set of questions. Maybe the story is not about civilization versus barbarism. Maybe it is about resilience versus rigidity. Maybe it is about the incredible human capacity to reorganize and rebuild when old systems fail. These discoveries also teach us a vital lesson about adaptation that has deep relevance for our own time. Because while archaeologists were uncovering the truth about how Roman cities transformed, another group of scholars was piecing together the story of how, centuries later, European cities finally came roaring back to life. Then, against all expectations, came the miracle. Around the year 1000 AD, after centuries of localization and transformation, a new and explosive energy began to sweep across Europe. Cities did not just begin to grow again, they were reborn with a dynamism and a spirit of innovation that would have astonished even the Romans. But here is the crucial twist. These were not revivals of the old Roman model. They were a completely new kind of city, founded on principles the ancient world could never have conceived. Welcome to the story of the greatest urban comeback in history. And it began in the most improbable of places, northern Italy, where a group of cities was about to invent modern capitalism. Picture yourself in the northern Italian city of Milan around the year 1100. There are no emperors or great territorial lords here. Instead, you see a city governing itself, run by a council of its own citizens called a commune. The air hums with a new kind of energy, the energy of commerce and industry. You see merchants organizing caravans to cross the Alps to the great fairs in France and Germany. You see workshops producing high-quality metalwork and armor that is sought after across Europe. You see lawyers drawing up complex commercial contracts and bankers developing new ways to finance trade. If someone told you that this bustling, self-governing town would soon be wealthy enough to defy and defeat the Holy Roman Emperor, you would think it impossible. but you would be witnessing the birth of a revolutionary idea, that a city's power could come not from inherited authority or military conquest, but from the collective economic energy of its free citizens. Let me show you exactly how this worked, because the success of the Italian city republics reveals the formula that would ignite the European urban renaissance. The secret ingredient was a series of institutional innovations that the Roman world had never developed. Chief among these was the creation of sophisticated forms of commercial partnership that allowed merchants to pool their capital, share the risks of long-distance trade, and undertake ventures of unprecedented scale and complexity. According to the groundbreaking research of economic historian Frederick Lane, a single Genoese trading voyage to the Levant in the 12th century might be funded by dozens of individual investors, each contributing a small share and receiving a proportional slice of the profits. But what made this revolutionary was that these partnerships were governed by written contracts, enforced by independent commercial courts, and supported by a culture that valued business acumen and risk-taking. The results were astounding. By 1200 AD, the city of Genoa, with a population of less than 100,000 and almost no agricultural hinterland, had a navy that could challenge kingdoms and trading outposts from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. This wealth was not extracted from peasants. It was created through commerce. How was this possible? These new cities had discovered the power of institutional innovation. Instead of trying to control territory, they focused on controlling trade routes and creating a legal and financial environment where business could flourish. They developed new forms of maritime insurance to protect against losses at sea. They pioneered the use of bills of exchange, which allowed merchants to transfer large sums of money across Europe without physically moving gold and silver. They created the first modern banks. Can you see how fundamentally different this was from the Roman model? Roman cities were primarily centers of consumption and administration, supported by taxes from the countryside. These new Italian cities were centers of production and innovation, generating their own wealth through trade and finance, and Milan and Genoa were not alone. Across northern Italy, a constellation of independent city-states was experiencing a similar boom. Venice, as we saw, became a maritime empire built on trade. Pisa became a major naval power. But perhaps the most incredible story belongs to Florence, a landlocked city that became the financial center of medieval Europe, despite having no direct access to the sea and few natural resources. Florence's story is so compelling because it demonstrates how a city can create immense wealth through purely intellectual and organizational innovation. Florentine wool merchants did not just sell cloth, they created a massive integrated manufacturing system. They imported raw wool from England and Spain, had it processed by a series of specialized workshops in and around the city, and exported the finished luxury cloth all over the known world. But the city's true genius was in banking. According to historian Richard Goldthwaite's research, great Florentine banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi established branches in every major commercial center in Europe. They financed kings and popes. They invented double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed for a much more sophisticated analysis of profit and loss. They created, in essence, the nervous system of the medieval European economy. The wealth this created was unprecedented. By the early 14th century, the per capita income in Florence was among the highest in the world, a level that most of Europe would not reach for another 400 years.
But these Italian republics were just the first spark. The fire of urban revival was spreading across Europe, adapting to different local conditions, but always driven by the same principles of commercial freedom and civic self-governance. In Flanders, modern-day Belgium, cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres became the centers of a massive textile industry. They were not just cities of merchants, they were cities of makers.
As historian Martha Howell has shown, these cities developed a complex system of production with thousands of specialized weavers, dyers, and finishers, all organized through a network of powerful guilds. This was not just craft production, it was an early form of industrialization. Meanwhile, in northern Germany, cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Danzig were creating something equally novel, the Hanseatic League. This was not a state or an empire, it was a voluntary commercial and defensive confederation of merchant cities. The Hanseatic League established a trading monopoly over the Baltic and North Seas, connecting the raw materials of Russia and Scandinavia with the manufactured goods of Western Europe. According to research by Philippe Dollinger, the League at its height was a major European power, with its own navy and the ability to wage war and negotiate treaties. But what made it so revolutionary was its structure. It was a network, not a hierarchy. It was a league of equals cooperating for mutual economic benefit. Do you see the new pattern that's emerging? The medieval urban revival was not about recreating the centralized top-down Roman model. It was about creating something entirely new, a decentralized network of independent, specialized cities cooperating and competing through the mechanisms of the market. This represented a fundamental breakthrough in how human societies could be organized. It demonstrated that prosperity and innovation could be generated from the bottom up through the voluntary cooperation of free citizens rather than being imposed from the top down by an imperial power. But perhaps most remarkably, this urban explosion was achieved without the kind of massive, state-led infrastructure projects that had defined Roman urbanism. Medieval cities did not have vast aqueducts or perfectly straight imperial highways. What they had was something far more powerful. A set of institutions, commercial law, corporate finance, civic governance that unleashed human creativity and cooperation on an unprecedented scale. The lessons learned in these medieval cities about commerce, innovation, and self-governance would lay the foundations for the modern world. But before we draw that final connection, we must consider what this entire epic journey teaches us about the timeless challenges of urban existence. The story we have just traversed is not merely about the past. It is a living blueprint for understanding the forces that shape every city on Earth today. As I have researched this long cycle of urban collapse and rebirth, I have been continually struck by how the same vulnerabilities, the same patterns of failure, and the same principles of resilience echo through the centuries, and some of the parallels between the fall of the Roman world and the challenges facing our own are frankly chilling. Let me illustrate what I mean by taking you on a brief tour of some contemporary cities that are wrestling with dilemmas remarkably similar to those faced by Roman cities 2,500 years ago. Let's start in a place like St. Louis, Missouri. In 1950, St. Louis was a major American industrial and transportation hub with a population of over 850,000 people. It was a thriving, confident city. Sound familiar? It is almost a perfect echo of our descriptions of Roman provincial capitals like Lugdunum or Carnuntum at their peak. But by 2020, the city's population had fallen to below 300,000, a decline of nearly 65%, a demographic collapse that is statistically comparable to what many post-Roman cities experienced. Large areas of the city have been cleared of buildings, leaving behind an urban landscape that has been described as urban prairie, eerily reminiscent of the fields and pastures that grew within the ancient walls of Rome. What caused this? The same fundamental pattern we have seen again and again, the city's core economic reason for being withered away. As industrial manufacturing and river transport declined, St. Louis lost the specialized economic functions that had made it a vital node in the national economy. Without that economic engine, maintaining the vast infrastructure built for a much larger population became an impossible burden. Does this not sound like the same slow strangulation that afflicted Roman cities when their trade routes were cut and their economic purpose vanished? Or consider the challenges facing many single industry towns around the world, from the former coal mining valleys of Wales to the shrunken timber towns of the Pacific Northwest. These communities have all experienced profound crises as their single economic foundation became obsolete. According to research by urban planner Justin Hollander, hundreds of cities worldwide are currently experiencing long-term population decline, a phenomenon he terms shrinking cities. This is a demographic trend on a scale that has few historical parallels outside of the collapse of ancient civilizations. But here is where the story gets fascinating, because some of these modern cities are discovering paths to recovery that uncannily mirror the survival strategies of places like Rome, Constantinople, and Venice. Consider the city of Bilbao in the Basque country of Spain. In the 1980s, it was a city in deep crisis, its traditional industries of shipbuilding and steel production in terminal decline. Instead of trying to subsidize its dying industries, Bilbao made a radical pivot. It reinvented itself as a global center for art, culture, and architecture, famously symbolized by the construction of the Guggenheim Museum. And the city invested in knowledge, design, and services. Sound familiar? This is precisely the strategy that Constantinople used when it transitioned from a territorial empire to a center for high-value manufacturing and intellectual capital. Or look at the reinvention of Lowell, Massachusetts. Once a booming center of the American textile industry, the city was devastated when the mills closed. But Lowell managed to turn its post-industrial landscape into an asset. It transformed its historic mill buildings into a national park, university campuses, and hubs for new technology companies. It leveraged its unique history to build a new economy based on education, tourism, and innovation. This is the same fundamental strategy Rome used when it repurposed its ancient ruins into assets for a new pilgrimage-based economy. But the parallels run even deeper than economic strategy. Modern cities are confronting infrastructure crises that would feel very familiar to a late Roman administrator. The American Society of Civil Engineers regularly gives the nation's infrastructure a grade of C or D+, estimating a funding gap in the trillions of dollars needed for repairs to roads, bridges, and water systems. This is in essence the same crisis of deferred maintenance that led to the decay of the Roman road network and the failure of the aqueducts. Just like their Roman predecessors, many modern cities are facing a painful choice: either raise taxes to potentially unsustainable levels or watch their vital systems crumble. In response, some cities are beginning to adopt what could be called post-imperial strategies. Cities like Flint, Michigan, and Youngstown, Ohio, have experimented with plans to strategically shrink, concentrating services and resources in denser core neighborhoods
while converting abandoned areas to green space. This is a modern echo of how the population of late antique Rome consolidated into a few small districts within the vast empty shell of the old imperial city.
But some of the challenges our cities face are without historical precedent. The threat of climate change, for example, is putting a strain on urban systems on a global scale. Rising sea levels pose an existential threat to coastal cities from Miami to Jakarta. More extreme weather events are overwhelming stormwater systems designed for more stable climate. And yet, the core principles of urban resilience, learned from the long histories of Roman and medieval cities, remain the same. The cities that are most likely to thrive are those that foster economic diversity, invest in social cohesion and human capital, and create flexible and adaptive systems of governance. Can't you see the timeless patterns? Urban success has never been just about building bigger walls or grander monuments. It is about creating environments where diverse people can cooperate, where innovation is possible, and where communities can adapt to change. The cities that survived the fall of Rome were not always the biggest, they were the most adaptable. Rome survived by repurposing itself. Constantinople thrived by innovating. Venice succeeded by inventing a whole new economic model. Modern cities facing their own existential challenges can draw powerful lessons from these examples. Instead of clinging to obsolete industrial models, they can cultivate new sources of economic strength. Instead of relying on a single industry, they can foster a diverse ecosystem. Instead of being trapped by infrastructure they can no longer afford, they can creatively adapt their physical footprint to their current reality. But the most important lesson from the long story of Roman and medieval cities is this: urban civilization is simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than we tend to believe. The complex systems that support urban life can and do fail, but the human impulse to come together in communities to trade, create, and solve problems is incredibly persistent. When the old systems break down, people have a remarkable capacity to invent new ones. The key, as the great urban theorist Jane Jacobs argued, is to maintain the underlying conditions of diversity and connection that allow for this constant process of creation and renewal. Cities that protect this creative capacity can weather almost any storm. And that brings us to the final and most important lesson from our long journey through urban rise, fall, and rebirth. Because understanding how cities have faced existential threats in the past is not just an academic exercise. It is an essential tool for building the future. So here we stand at the end of this epic journey, and I want to leave you with one final thought that I hope will change the way you see the city or town you live in, because the story of Rome's cities is not in the end a story about ruins. It is a story about the enduring human quest to build communities that are prosperous, adaptable, and resilient. Think about the arc of our narrative tonight. We saw how the most complex urban society of the ancient world was not felled by a single dramatic blow, but by the slow, cumulative failure of its most critical systems, its economy, its political institutions, its infrastructure, and ultimately, its sense of shared purpose. It is a powerful reminder that civilization is not a destination we arrive at. It is a difficult and ongoing process of maintenance, adaptation, and renewal. But we have also witnessed something profoundly optimistic. We have seen the incredible, almost miraculous human capacity for reinvention. When the formal structure of the Roman world dissolved, people did not simply descend into chaos. They created new ways of organizing themselves, new economic models,
and new social institutions, and eventually they built a new urban world that, in many respects, surpassed the one they had lost.
The medieval cities that rose from the ashes of the Roman world, with their spirit of commercial innovation, their fierce independence, and their cooperative networks, were not a lesser version of Rome. They were a new and powerful answer to the age-old question of how humans can best live together. And this gives me immense hope for our own time, because the challenges we face in our cities today, climate change, economic disruption, social inequality, are in many ways modern iterations of these ancient problems. The context has changed, but the fundamental dynamics of urban success and failure remain remarkably pet. Let me share with you the three most vital lessons that I believe this 2,500-year saga of urban resilience can teach us. Lessons that are as relevant to a modern metropolis as they were to ancient Rome. First, diversity is the bedrock of resilience, but it must be actively nurtured. The cities that survived and flourished from 6th century Constantinople to 21st century New York were those that fostered a rich diversity of economies, cultures, and ideas. They did not rely on a single industry or single way of life. They understood that strength comes from having many different ways to solve problems and create value. But this kind of diversity is not an accident. It is the result of conscious choices. Choices to welcome new people, to support small and varied businesses, and to protect the unique character of different neighborhoods. Second, physical infrastructure is critical, but the social and political institutions that manage it are even more important. Rome had the greatest infrastructure of the ancient world, but when its institutions of governance, law, and commerce broke down, the roads and aqueducts were useless. Today, we rightly worry about our aging bridges and power grids. But the most successful cities are also investing in their social infrastructure, their schools, their legal systems, their community organizations, and their traditions of civic engagement. They are building institutions that are capable of adapting to change, not just preserving the status quo. And third, the key to long-term urban success is not to resist change, but to manage it creatively. The cities that failed in the post-Roman period were often the ones that tried most desperately to cling to the past. The cities that succeeded were those that were flexible, experimental, and open to reinvention. This does not mean erasing history. Rome survived by building its future on the foundations of its unique past. The most resilient cities learned how to be both custodians of their heritage and laboratories for the future. Now, I want you to think about your own community. Whether you live in a global megacity or a small town, how could these lessons be applied where you are? How can you, in your own life, contribute to building a more diverse, institutionally strong, and adaptive community? Maybe it is as simple as choosing to support a local independent business, thereby strengthening your community's economic diversity. Maybe it is joining a local civic group, thereby strengthening its social infrastructure. Maybe it is simply staying informed and participating in local governance, helping your community make intelligent choices about its future. Because here is the ultimate realization that comes from studying urban history. Cities are not just places on a map. They are collective projects that we are all, consciously or unconsciously, building together every single day. The Romans who engineered Lugdunum and Ephesus believed they were building for all time. And in a sense, they were. Their innovations in law, engineering, and civic organization are woven into the DNA of the cities we inhabit today. But they were wrong in thinking that permanence meant changelessness. The true lesson of history is that endurance is a product of evolution. The cities that last are not the ones that are set in stone. They are the ones that are constantly remaking themselves in response to new challenges, while always preserving the fundamental magic of urban life. The ability of diverse people to come together to create, to innovate, and to solve problems too big for any one person to handle alone. And that is exactly what is happening in cities all over the world right now, as people work to solve the great challenges of our time. The story is not over. You are living in it. The next time you walk down a city street, I hope you will remember the incredible story we have explored together. Remember that the pavement beneath your feet is part of a tradition of urban life that has weathered the collapse of empires and the darkest of ages. Remember that your community is part of a story of innovation that stretches back for millennia. And remember that the choices you make every day are helping to write the next chapter in that story. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for your curiosity and your willingness to think deeply about the foundations of our world. And thank you for being part of the ongoing incredible story of human civilization, because it's what you are. The challenge of building resilient, humane, and thriving communities is not just history, it is the future that we are all creating together, one decision at a time. And I look forward to exploring more of these great human stories with you again soon. Until then, take care, dream of what is possible, and remember that the greatest cities are not built by emperors, but by the daily efforts of ordinary people like you, working together to create something extraordinary.